Hello, and in this video I'm going to focus on part 3. This is the trickier end of the test where the questions are much more complex and require a little bit more thought. So in this video we're going to talk about books, but we're going to also look at different ways that you can buy time. So before you start speaking in part 3, it's a good idea to think about what you're going to say. And when you speak in your native language, you do this, and it's called buying time. To buy time means to delay, to do something to give yourself more time. Now, you don't just sit there and think and say nothing, because that creates a very uncomfortable atmosphere in the exam. You need to do something in order to buy time. So let's take a look at some phrases that you could use. Just a moment, let me think. And notice how I'm saying it kind of slowly, so it's giving me more time to think about what I'm going to say. Just a second, I need to think about that. That's a good question. Oh, where do I start? Well, I suppose... Honestly, never thought about that before. Oh, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that, I guess. And if you listen to yourself in your native language, you will use words and phrases like, well, I guess, I suppose. You don't immediately go into answering the question. You always buy time. So if you can practice doing this in English, it will give you that little bit of extra time in the IELTS exam to think about some complex language for your answer. So we're going to focus on books in this video, and the question we're going to look at first, is there a difference between the types of books men and women like to read? Well, before we look at this model answer, let's have a look at some different book types. So we have non-fiction, fiction, autobiographies, horror, science fiction, chick lit and fantasy, because if you're talking about books, it's useful to know about the genres of books. Now, this is a very tricky word, genre, and it means type. It's a French word that we use in English, and we talk about genres of books. So my favourite genre of book is non-fiction, and non-fiction are factual books. They're not stories, they're books about dinosaurs or books about history. Fiction books, on the other hand, are novels. These are stories, and another way of saying a story is a novel. An autobiography is the life story of a real person. Now, there are two types. There's the autobiography, which is written by the person themselves, and there's the biography, which is written by another person. Horror. This can be used for films as well, if you like horror films, or the horror genre, and these are very frightening stories. Science fiction, often shortened to sci-fi. These are books about space travel, time travel, etc., maybe set in the future. Now, chick lit, this is a relatively new word in the English language, and it means books for women by women, generally romantic fiction. So my favourite genre of book is chick lit. Love stories, basically. And finally, fantasy. These are stories that are set in a fictional universe. So, for example, you could describe the Harry Potter books as fantasy. So now let's take a look at this model answer to is there a difference between the types of books men and women like to read? I've honestly never thought about that before, but I suppose there is. Firstly, I imagine you don't get many males reading chick lit, as they are not really interested in romantic fiction. In contrast, I guess men would opt for action and adventure type books when they read for pleasure. In addition, they would probably choose science fiction and fantasy fiction. However, there is no hard and fast rule about one's choice of reading material, and most genres are liked by both genders. So you can see we've got the buying time at the start of the answer. I've never thought about that before, but I suppose there is. We've got good discourse markers throughout the answer. Always think of part 3 questions like a mini essay. Firstly, in contrast, in addition. And then we've put different genres, different types of books, chick lit, romantic fiction, science fiction, fantasy fiction. Opt for, this means choose. You've got read for pleasure. That's what you do when you're not reading it for studying, for example. I like to read for pleasure. There is no hard and fast rule. This means there's no rule, but we can make it more complex by calling it a hard and fast rule, like a strict rule. And I've used genres in there and genders. This word gender means man or woman, male or female. So you can see in that part 3 answer, we've got organisation, we've got buying time, and we've got lots of complex language connected to the topic. Let's take a look at another part 3 question from this topic of books. Do you think it's necessary to read the novel before watching the movie of that story? Why? Oh, that's a good question. Oh, where do I start? Well, I'm a strong believer in creating your own imaginary world from the words of the writer. This is especially true for stories of all genres. A movie shows how the director sees the personification of the characters and the plot in the story. So personally, I'd say yes. However, if you then watch the movie, you might totally disagree with the personification of the characters as they're not the same images in your head. So we've got our buying time at the start. That's a good question. Where do I start? Well, I'm a strong believer in, it's a good way to say I think, imaginary world. This is a world that's not real. The personification of the characters. This is bringing the characters to life in a movie. The plot in a story. This is what the story is about, the storyline. So yes, we've got again some very complex language in here and a useful phrase to buy time at the start. Finally, let's take a look at this question. Who reads more books, men or women? Why? Just a second, I need to think about that. It would be difficult to say. The reading habits of both genders depend on many factors such as time, money, and literacy levels. Furthermore, it depends on the age group. I don't actually think I can give a definitive answer to that question. So I've bought time at the beginning. Just a second, I need to think about that. It will be difficult to say. Talk about reading habits. These are how often you read, for example. So my reading habit is to read in bed for 20 minutes every night before I fall asleep. Genders, meaning both males and females. Literacy levels, useful for writing as well. This means the ability to read, how good a person is at reading. We talk about literacy levels of children in schools. Now, this last sentence, I don't actually think I can give a definitive answer to that question. So sometimes there are questions you just don't know how to answer, or you don't know the answer. So you can't just say this sentence, but you could say a little bit and then put this sentence at the end. And it's really useful to finish off your answer, because I'm sort of saying, I don't really know the answer, but I'm saying it in a much more complex way. So a definitive answer is like a final answer, a good answer. So I don't actually think I can give a definitive answer to that question. Okay, hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.